Okay, first review for the week is going to be Lord January, LitRPG Cultivation Saga, Year of the Sword, book number 1, written by Dakota Kraut. It is 427 pages, $4.99. It's available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Time is money. Time is a what? Time is running out. Grant Leap is an orphaned, mortal farmhand in a world where cultivation methods and weapons of power are jealously guarded and only passed down among family. He's not content with his lot. As a Januarian, someone living in a district January, he should be living the good life just like everybody else. Foods, parties, food, entertainment, and food are the minimum requirements. As an orphan, especially a reviled Leap, there's not even a chance of him being treated as human. When a celestial event pours time magic into his field, coalescing into a lost weapon of power, Grant leaps at the opportunity to advance beyond even the scope of standard cultivation. At the first touch of the weapon, the orphan gains everything he's ever wanted: a sword and a name. Also, a pesky mandatory quest with his life as a price of failure. It doesn't take him long to realize that the best thing for him to do is to sell it and live on borrowed time. Yet, that would never happen. The blade offers him the first major choice he's ever had to make: surrender to his desires or live like a king. There we go. And I think that's a pretty good description of like the setup for the series. It isn't really described like what's happening for the rest of it though. The story kind of combines a kind of physical cultivation technique with RPG progression. The main character is a Leap, one of the few people born on a leap day, February 29th. As such, he's relegated to a slave position in his society and for his entire life is forced to work for his master, at least until a magic sword lands in front of him and he gets the quest to defeat the Lord of the Land, Lord January, as the first step to restore the world's balance. What follows is a journey of the main character to learn the ways of the sword, get into shape, and stumble through the world to get to his goal while avoiding the forces that want to stop him. It's a lot of training and fighting and a good bit of world building. So there you go. On the RPG side of things, really consistent stuff. The main character increases his stats, cultivation levels through completing quests, defeating opponents, or killing them. It's kind of given a choice. Training also improves his stats. There's a unique aspect to the progression system in that you're cultivating time and increments like seconds, minutes, hours, days, all the way up to, of course, weeks, months, and years. It's kind of the theme of the series with like the Lord January kind of bit. Each one, like the districts, has a different month's name: January, February, etc., which correspond, I think, to the releases of the books. They're used as a kind of progression currency instead of experience points, but also as a currency in the world. So like you're paid for food in seconds, like 3 seconds worth of whatever, maybe like renting a room for minutes, or an expensive piece of equipment for days. And it kind of lies up in that calendar kind of theme in the series. This is, I'll be honest, this is probably the most heavily criticized book I think Dakota Kraut has ever written. Reading some of the reviews and reading it myself, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see what they mean. So some of the things we're talking about are things that I don't necessarily have an issue with, but I think they've been repeated in the reviews enough to bring them up, of course. One of the biggest criticisms I think that I kind of agree with is the fact that the main character is unrealistically naive. And I think this is at least partially showing up. I think part of the issue is that this is already themed to be like a 12-book series for one character, going along with the months of the year. And I want to say that the author might have all these books already written. So when he's planning out the progression for the character, that's a lot of space to cover. It's a lot of like progression to have in place. And so I think in this first book, he's left as a naive character because that's kind of how you're going to space it out for 12 books. Like you can't instantaneously go from slave to super genius. But what ends up happening in the actual story is that he keeps making like the same poor decisions or naive decisions again and again and again. And I think it kind of got on some of the readers' nerves, or at least made it feel unrealistic. And for me, I kind of felt that way as well. The main character in the story is treated almost as a slave. He's regularly beaten, not only by his master, but also by the population as a whole. In the grand scheme of things, like it's revealed later on in the story, this is minor spoiler, that Leaps like himself were regularly murdered and killed by other cities or other locations besides where he's at. And so with that kind of attitude, it felt really weird to me, at least, that the main character would still be really kind, that he would continually trust people with his secrets, that he wouldn't be hesitant to trust these people who you would assume like were going to beat him because of what his position is. And throughout the entire story, he kind of never learns the lesson of not trusting people. Even though he's told repeatedly by various sources, including his magic sword, don't tell people his weaknesses, don't tell people your secrets. And I understand within the context of story building and advancing the plotline that some things have to occur for some plot developments and some surprise twists. They weren't really twists to me. But it kind of happens repeatedly throughout the story, even all the way up to almost the very end of the story. And I guess for me, it didn't feel like a consistent outcome for how he's treated throughout his entire life as a servant class. You feel like because of the way he's treated, for me at least, I would have thought he would have been super suspicious of everybody, not trusting anybody at all, always wanting to get revenge. And that's just not who the character is. Now, on the positive side, I'll say that the author is super consistent with this behavior. He made a choice. He stuck with it throughout the entire novel. So, there's that. But for me, that's not really a huge deal. The main character is going to be who he's going to be. Another criticism of the story, and I'm not sure how much I agree with this necessarily, but it is repeatedly mentioned in quite a few reviews that the novel fat shames. And I want to say like this is sort of true, but for me at least, I think that it's definitely a reflection of the culture in this district versus an outside perspective. Because the main character grows up in a district where there is a super abundance of food, and there's lore and the story to explain why. But it's because there's so much food that's meant for like essentially a population 7 times that size. Nobody has to starve. Like food is given away freely, and there's lots of luxurious food for everybody. And it's not super expensive necessarily, but like a lot of the culture in the short revolves around eating essentially this excess food. Doesn't quite make sense to me on an economic scale why a district will continue to produce that much food. But that's a separate issue. But that's what the culture is. All the cultivation in the story revolves around, in this district revolves around eating. The more you eat, the stronger you're going to get, the better your cultivation is. Again, there's a whole cultivation, theory and practice to revolving around eating more food, and the more powerful you are, the richer you are, the bigger you're going to be. That's kind of the culture here, and it's been that way for hundreds of years. And the kind of fat shaming kind of comes into play from the perspective of the magical sword. It has personality talks, and so while the main character is training, the character that is the sword, I think is based on a kind of a drill sergeant mentality from kind of our world. Although that's not explicitly stated, even though he's called Sarge. It has that kind of put down mentality, like you're terrible, you're this and that, you're fat, you're a big slug, and I can't believe you want to be this way. It's that point of view, but I always feel like that's just kind of a contrary point of view of a entity that has existed outside of this particular culture. And so from his point of view, everybody's obese, everybody's super unhealthy to his mindset. And so there is that kind of training mentality. Now, whether they think that's appropriate or not, or it's fat shaming, that's up to you. But I definitely understand where that point of view is coming from, especially with some of the terrible things, I'll be honest, that this character Sergeant kind of says when he's training the main character. Like he definitely insults people he doesn't know, is by saying they're killing themselves, they're being lazy, they should be ashamed for letting themselves get obese, how much better a person is when he loses weight. And it just, for me, it felt, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I get that criticism that's happening in the story. It is what it is. It very much is part of like the differences in lore. For me, as somebody who's like familiar with this, I'm like, yeah, this is actually not untrue, in that the wealthier you are, the bigger you are. Like being heavy was a sign of wealth historically, because in an agrarian society, like only the wealthy had enough money to like eat healthy, eat rich foods, eat meat on a regular basis. So that's not untrue, I guess. So there you go. But again, it's kind of a weird. It kind of just follows the setup of the story and takes it to these interesting and sometimes extreme, I guess, that didn't always sit so well with some people. So there you go. Overall, I think the story was okay for me. It's not my favorite book that the author's ever written. I think part of the issue is for me that I'm not huge into Cultivation in the first place. So that's probably what part of it is for me. But the other issues did weigh down on me. Like I didn't like the attitude of Sarge as a character. I did think of like, yeah, that's kind of fashioning of that, I guess. Like but it's really just that character. Like the rest of the characters in the story, it's their culture. It's their things that they're used to, so they don't see it that way. But like some of the story does come across that way. For me, I don't really care about it too much. I didn't really show, but it did kind of lessen my enjoyment because I didn't enjoy that particular attitude of that character, so I didn't really like him. Even though he was doing other great things for the main character. Additionally, I had a really hard time wanting the main character to succeed, and that's not a great thing. It just hard time connecting with such a naive character because, as I said it before, I feel like the outcome of being treated like a slave your entire life wouldn't be that you're kind and you're trusting of everybody, no matter their circumstances. So I felt like that was hard for me to kind of accept, and then main character making the same mistakes over and over. And again, I understand that his growth has to take place over 12 books, so that's probably part of the reason that the character maintains that attitude throughout the entire story. The main character does progress in other ways. He definitely grows in martial power. He grows in gaining friends and adventures, and he has all this great stuff. And there's plenty of action in the story. The martial arts stuff, action stuff is really nicely done. There's like some really good lore building in developing the lore of the world as a whole, but also like this particular district. So much so that people invest in the things that other people say about it. So I guess that's a good thing. I just found it hard to root for the character a little bit. So for me, I didn't enjoy as much as I did other stories from the author, but still, on the whole, pretty decent story. I understand that this is just kind of the beginning for the main character in the story. And so I'm sure his growth is going to be paced appropriately for what seems to be a 12-book series. But for me, it gets a score of 7.2 out of 10. That's still a good score, just on the lower side of enjoyment. That's Lore January, a LitRPG Cultivation Saga, Year of the Sword, book number 1, with the score of 7.2 out of 10.